Okay, so yeah, ZeroBrush was already super awesome in that it integrated baking into the ZeroBrush layer system. So as soon as you baked a layer, the layer would be visible and paintable for both Blender Render and Cycles, just like any other layer you could paint on here, which is awesome. However, it had some weird, quirky stuff and some inconsistencies and some limitations that have now all been entirely ironed out and that I'm really excited to show you today. Okay, so if we press Q to bring up the ZeroBrush options, the first thing we'll notice here is that we've got a new menu layout in ZeroBrush 1.78, and we now have this whole little section kind of devoted to bake type stuff. So the bake system before had a few options for you to select from directly, such as doing a full material bake, or an ambient bake and a shadow bake, but really there was only about 2 or 3 options for each render mode. Now with the new bake system, you can actually bake one or multiple objects using any bake method that Blender has to offer. So here in Blender Render, if we click on Bake Selected, we have the option to do a full material bake, ambient occlusion, shadow, normals, etc. So you can actually now bake everything instantly into the ZeroBrush layer system. For some of these bake types, such as displacement, it doesn't really make sense to have the baked result be put into the ZeroBrush layer system because things like displacement maps are for use with displacement modifiers, as well as usually a subsurface modifier on top of that or something. So what's amazing about this bake system, in addition to the fact that anything you bake will be fed into the system and thus made instantly visible and usable and paintable for both Blender Render and Cycles. In addition to all that, ZeroBrush actually captures these commands before they're run and sets up the scene in ways that need to be set up to ensure that the bake actually works. And along with that, there is now a new message system that will show up whenever you try to bake something. So for instance, under Bake Selected, we click Full Material Bake here. We'll get this little message now that says, hey, baking is a rendering process which may take a few minutes to an hour depending on the size. And then it lets you know that you can control the size of the new baked image by adjusting the new layer width and height values in the options menu, as well as the bake quality. And then you're given a choice to proceed with the bake. But maybe you think, oh, you know what? I really would like to change the size of what this is going to be baked to first. So let me cancel that out and change my new layer width or height to be smaller or bigger. So say I just wanted to do some testing. So maybe I wanted to drop this down to 512, which a convenience thing in ZeroBrush is that if you set the width value, it will automatically set the height value, because it's usually the case that you need a square image. But of course, you can adjust that height value if you would like here afterwards. So if we wanted this to be rectangular, we could, increase, change this value or whatever, but I don't really want to do that. So not only will it present you with messages, but you'll actually get individualized messages regarding different types of baking operations, because there's some quirky, weird stuff in Blender that isn't always super self-evident when baking things. So for instance, if I were to press Shift A, under Mesh, add a plane, S to scale it up, G to grab, bring this cube up, and maybe just press D to duplicate this cube a few times. And so say I were to press Q, and of course, whenever you're painting and stuff like that, it's best to use the Use Cycles button to switch between Blender Render and Cycles, because it will automatically convert all painted things between Blender Render and Cycles and vice versa. So if we click Use Cycles, all of our painted things are now also visible and paintable in Cycles here. But anyway, say I wanted to, under Bake Selected here, so say I wanted to bake a shadow map. Notice I get a different message here saying, hey, shadow maps baked in Cycles can only use light from actual Blender lamps to create shadows, and you can't use stuff like lighting from your environment or emission shaders on materials. So basically this is letting me know that if I try to bake right now this shadow map onto this plane, it's going to show up black because I don't have any Blender lamps in the scene. So actually, if I were to go ahead and press Q and just go ahead and press Bake Shadow and go ahead and proceed with it, lo and behold, I'm going to get an entirely black map here because I'm not using any Blender lamps. Even though if I press Shift Z to do a render preview, we do have lighting from this generic white environment back here. However, when baking shadow maps in Cycles specifically, Blender wants those lamps around. So I could press Q And another added feature in ZeroBrush 1.78 is this material options menu. So this was not an available option if you didn't use Sensei Format. It is now an available option because I've written custom operators for all of the options in here. So we could use this to remove UV maps, remove materials. I'll go ahead and remove the material from this. When I tried to bake that shadow map, we got this message. And it even tells us how we can add a lamp so that the bake will work. It says press Shift A and under lamp, add a lamp for shadow bakes to work, or else perform a full bake if you just want to, bake everything. So what I can do is press Shift A and under lamp, add say a spotlight here. And of course we can't really see spotlights in cycles mode. However, if I press Shift Z to do a render preview, well, I'm not seeing it much anyway because of the light from the environment. So I will turn the light from the environment all the way off. And okay, so now we can see the effect of this spotlight. And if I click over here under nodes, increase the strength even way crazy higher, then press Shift Z to get out of render preview mode. So now that I have an actual lamp in here, if I go to bake selected and shadow here in cycles and press OK, hey, look, the bake actually did something instead of just, giving us a black map, which is very nice. So that's kind of the idea behind the ZeroBrush message system, which has not only now been integrated for when you're baking things to give you helpful tips on stuff like that, but also when using other ZeroBrush tools as well. So for instance, if I were to go my brushes here, load a brush up, and say I wanted to use the layer from brush tool in ZeroBrush, if I click on that, I'm going to now get a little message about what's going on here, how to use this, and so on. So this just makes using ZeroBrush a lot more easy, because occasionally, even if you learn how to do something, maybe you don't use it for like several months and then you kind of forget something about it. So it's real helpful there. So I'm going to go ahead and press File, New, Reload Startup File. So one of the first new bake features that I was really happy to finally get put into ZeroBrush when I started redoing the bake system was the ability to bake normal maps from a high poly object to a low poly object. ZeroBrush already has the ability to bake normal maps from objects using multi-res modifiers. So if I were to press my sculpt button and press make sculptable, which does several things, but the biggest part of pressing make sculptable is that it adds a multi-res modifier to your object, and then you can add more detail to it and stuff like this. And so say I were to press space to bring up my brush selection brush here in ZeroBrush, maybe press 1 to go into front view, and I don't know, just make some kind of weird face here. Maybe turn on X mirror and increase my strength. Maybe add a bit more detail. Some weird dude's face. I don't know. Holding shift to inverse, of course. And maybe grab my inflate deflate brush, which is pretty sweet at making things look organic and bulbousy. Hold Control to do some smoothing. Shift X to increase that strength quite a bit. And okay, so yeah, I'm not trying to win any awards here. And let me put something that will definitely show up in a normal map, like these kind of jaggedy clay strip things. I mean, I don't know why he'd have this on his head. Maybe he's like really into subdermal implants. Anyway, okay, so we've got something like this. So we could already instantly create a normal map for an object, whether that object had any materials or UV maps or images. It didn't need any of that, or it could also have that on it and it would be integrated directly into the material. So all we have to do is press as normal. Of course, in the new system, we get a pop-up message now. If you're new to this kind of stuff telling you what's going on, you can just press OK. And that will add a material with a UV map, normal mapped image. This object had no UV mapping, no anything. And now all we have to do is press less, which here in the ZeroBrush menu basically just lowers all of the multi-res levels down. And this is so we can, actually see what the normal map's doing here. So if I were to come up here and press Z to go into wireframe, you can see here's what the actual size of a face is. Like where I'm going my mouse around, that's like the size of an actual polygon face there. Press Z to go back. But there is the normal mapped detail that was instantly added. We can, of course, adjust that by clicking on our texture paint button, and we'll have immediate access to this normal map value. And this not only is automatically built for Blender render, but cycles as well. So if I click on my cycles button to convert to cycles, here we have the normal map all set up and ready to go. And we could click back on this color layer and, paint or, load up some sweet texture brushes, whatever we needed to do, but it's all good to go there. Yeah, ZeroBrush has had that feature since its commercial release. However, now in addition to that method of baking normal maps, we can also bake a high poly mesh to a low poly mesh by simply selecting the high poly first, then shift selecting the low poly, and under our bake options, just press normals, and we can bake that way too, which I'm really excited to have that added to ZeroBrush. And really the high poly model to the low poly model is sort of the traditional way of baking normal maps. So I'll go ahead and show you how that works. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Q, and I'm going to go ahead and remove the material from this object. And I'll go ahead and in Sensei Format, I can just press W, which will increase subdivision levels on basically anything that does that kind of stuff. So we can get the detail back up on this thing. So if I press Z to go into wireframe, we have this like super high poly model. And just because this is a demonstration, we're going to pretend that we, say dynamically sculpted this thing. So say it looks really cool, but its mesh underneath is really a mess. So we would have to retopologize this. So I'm going to press D to duplicate this. And so I'm just going to lower the detail levels on this one, maybe to something like that, and go ahead and apply it. And so let's pretend that this is our high poly sculpt, and I'll go ahead and just apply this like this. If I press Z to go into wireframe, you can see how many tons of faces that make up this high poly sculpt here, and then our low poly sculpt here. So say we'd actually sculpted this dynamically, and then this was like a retopologized object, even though we actually just used multi-res modifiers to make it because it was easier. But we can now bake this detail onto any object we want. Okay, so all we need to do now is get this positioned over this because we want to bake the detail from this guy onto this low poly guy. So the simplest way to do that is for me to just right click on this object, which automatically snaps my cursor to the object in Sensei Format. Then I'm going to press this, which moves the selected object to the location of the cursor. And that's what I want. I should have probably named these something a little more meaningful than cube and cube 0.001. So let me rename this guy to high detail and rename this guy to low detail, because once you have these objects sitting on top of each other, it's a little difficult to select them in the 3D view because you got to select them in the proper order to get them to bake. So I'll move that guy back there. So now I know which is which, and I want to bake the high detail model onto the low detail model. So all I do is select the high detail model first because I want its detail to be baked to the low detail, then shift click the low detail one, and that's all the prep work I have to do or will ever have to do to bake a normal map in ZeroBrush if we are using this traditional method. So all I do now is press Q, and under Bake Selected, click on Normals. But before I do that, I'm going to drop the size of this new normal map down to about half, so about 1024, which will make that 1024 by 1024, just so I don't have to wait so long while I'm doing all these bake examples. And so under Bake Selected, just click Normals, and we get a nice helpful message here. And you might want to leave these messages on when you're first getting used to baking things. And then once you get in the swing of things, you can press this to disable these messages. And of course, if you ever need to enable them again, it lets you know you can do that in Options menu. But this is just telling us we're performing a traditional bake, basically. This will bake the detail from the high poly mesh onto the low poly mesh, make sure the objects are in the same position, yada, yada, yada. Basically stuff I just told you. Then press OK. All right, that has completed. So now if I go ahead and hide the visibility of the high detail model in the 3D viewport so we can just see the low detail model, we'll see that the normal map has baked right on here. So this guy didn't have a material. It actually did have a UV map from when we baked the multi-res on there before, but it wouldn't have needed that. It would have been generated for it automatically. So if we click on the texture paint button now, we have this normal map, which we can adjust here, and which is of course visible and renderable in cycles as well. Press that, switch back to Blender Render. So now whatever method you need to bake normal maps on is now super easy with ZeroBrush. Another kind of quirky, annoying thing in ZeroBrush's bake system from before was that while you could bake objects with multiple materials in Blender Render, you couldn't really do that in cycles. In the new system, all those old limitations have been completely removed. So I'm going to go ahead and press File, a new Reload Startup File, so we can kind of demonstrate that. So if I wanted to do that in Blender Render, I could say, let's go ahead and add a generic monkey head here, tap W a few times, give that some smoothing in Sensei Format. Using my Alchemy material library here, I'm going to click on my open source pack library. Okay, so if I were to add like, I don't know, bone material to this monkey head, press tab to go into edit mode, and select a row of faces and maybe add like some copper, and then alt select this row of faces and add this sweet molten material here. And I can close my library up, press tab to go back into object mode. If I press Shift Z, we can see all these different materials on this Suzanne head here. So baking an object with multiple materials worked most of the time in Blender Render with ZeroBrush, but it definitely never worked in cycles. So if I wanted to bake this, I can press Q, and I'll go ahead and drop the size down of this a bit to make things easier on myself so I don't have to wait so long for this stuff to bake. And I can go ahead and do a full material bake here. Of course, we get a message here. Okay, so these materials have now been baked. And of course, once you bake anything in Blender Render or in Cycles, that baked image gets added as a ZeroBrush layer, which you can of course paint on or adjust the ZB sliders. It's also visible, paintable, and editable in both Cycles and Blender Render. So here we're looking at it in Cycles now. Turn on my quick lights, press my render preview button, and here are those materials that we baked from out of Blender Render. We could adjust the reflectivity, their bumpiness here in Cycles, and what have you. All right, let's see how this works with Cycles materials now. So I'm going to press this to go back into object mode, and I'll go ahead and just press Shift A, under Mesh, add another monkey head, and just move it over here, something like this. Okay. So let's do the same thing, but add some Cycles materials to this. And this time I will be using the default Alchemy base pack, which comes with the Alchemy material library. So I'm going to click on the Alchemy base pack there and open up my library here. The Alchemy material library allows you to paint directly with complex materials. So this is different from texture painting. When you're doing this, you're actually painting with the material itself, not just adding a texture layer or texture node with an image. So for instance, if I were to add this concrete material, Cycles material to the Suzanne head, I could press Use, and say I wanted to paint something onto this, or I don't know, I guess copper, which wouldn't really make sense, but why does it need to? So I could paint this material directly on here using Alchemy by selecting this material, then pressing the paint button here. This, of course, automatically sends me into the mode that I need to be in, sets everything up so I can start painting. Okay, so right now, if I were to press Shift Z to go into render preview mode, we can see this copper, which the copper is much more reflective than the concrete material. So it's mostly reflecting this, the black background because I have quick lights on. But of course, as it renders, we can see the copper coming in there. Anyway, so that's what that looks like. So I could go ahead and press Finish Painting. So now you can see down here I actually have 3 materials on this object because the Alchemy paint system, what it does, it creates a painted material and then it keeps all the materials that you're actually using to paint with on the object, so you can actually switch those out on the fly if you want. So I could actually, switch this copper out for any other material later on if I felt like it, which is cool. But anyway, the point is this object now has multiple materials. So I could actually, even add more materials to this if I were to press tab to go into edit mode. And I don't know, press C to bring up my circle brush and just like paint all the faces of this eye here, and maybe add even, another material. So how about ice? So we'll press use. And so now we've got several materials all on this thing, but we can bake this all now to one single image really simply. And I'm just gonna close up my library here. And if I press Q, bake selected, just gonna do a full bake here, and this will bake all of these materials on this object to the object. Just press OK. Okay, so that has finished, and it's pretty speckly. Probably I should have increased that bake quality from 25 samples, because if you've ever rendered in cycles, then you know that 25 samples is not a lot. But anyway, so we can see all those materials baked, and old Ice Eye has baked here. However, it was mostly reflecting this black background, so it looks pretty black. Now we can click on the texture paint button and do whatever we want to this new baked layer, which is pretty sweet. We can hop back into Blender Render and affect this stuff there. So, we're able to easily bake in Blender Render and then use it in cycles, or vice versa. So after your initial bake, you're free to bake on as much stuff else as you want. So for instance, if we wanted to bake a shadow map in Blender Render onto this cycles baked materials, we could. So let me add something that will show a shadow on it when I bake this map. Okay, so if I were to press Shift Z to go into render preview, we can see where that shadow is being cast from this torus here. I'm going to, in my lights menu, increase shadow darkness, which is an option available if you are in Blender Render mode here in Sensei Format. And this will just increase the darkness of any lamps that cast shadows, just quicker for me to do. Okay, so if I actually grab this torus here, we can see that shadow moving around on there, real nice. And if I press Shift Z to get out of material viewport shading, I've got this material here where I've baked all these cycles materials onto this monkey head. Now I could either press my texture paint button to go back into texture paint mode and bake this, or we can bake it straight from object mode. If I just press Q and under bake selected here, if I click shadow here, get the standard bake message here, because this will basically work as you would expect. So no special messages beyond, hey, you're baking something. And go ahead and press OK. And there we have that really dark, well, maybe I made the shadow too dark, a shadow baked onto my Suzanne head here. So if I move this away from where that shadow is, you can see it still stays, or if I rotate it, you can see it's now, part of this object. So if I were to press my texture paint button, so we could, adjust the opacity of that, and we could actually turn on the bump value of a baked shadow if we wanted to. Kind of a weird effect. And then of course, if we switch to cycles, we can only display one of each of these layer types at a time in cycles. So these are both color layers, so we can only choose to display one of those at a time. However, we can easily merge as many layers as we want into a single layer to use them in cycles if we wanted to. So we could actually merge these. All we need to do is under options here, come down here and press merge layers. And this will merge all layers that you have the eyeball icon active here. So if I were to, say I had 9 or 10 layers here, if I were to close these eyeballs, then those layers would not be included in the merge, but because they're both open, they'll both be included in this new merged layer, which we get a special message about letting us know what's up. So I'll just press OK to make that. And so this is now merged these two layers into this new layer, and ZeroBrush does a real nice thing for us. It hides all of the layers that were used to create the merged layer, so you can just see the effect of the new merged layer there. So there it is. I can turn it off and on, and if I go into cycles with it, there it is all merged together for me to do cycles-y things to it. Press my render preview button there and what have you. So as you can see, we can bake in cycles, bake in Blender Render on the same material, go back and forth, and get the best of both worlds of these different bake options that are available, which are different depending on if you are in Blender Render or cycles. So we could actually head on over to sculpt mode if we wanted to. So I showed you earlier how you can instantly generate a normal map from objects with no materials or UV maps or anything, but you can also do that to objects with materials and UV maps or whatever. I'll just increase the subdivision on this thing here, this monkey head here, and kind of hard to see a little bit, maybe even one more. So I'm at 5 subdivision levels, and it's kind of hard to see under this material now, but I'm sculpting some crazy lines and stuff onto this Suzanne head. I'll go ahead and select this circle anchor brush thingy and make some the strength's a bit high, make some bumps and craters and stuff on the side of this head. And to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and increase the hardness a bit. You can see me doing that, and then I'm holding shift in the center of these when I'm painting to kind of create a crater. So the first one kind of raises up a circle, then I hold shift, which performs the inverse, and we've got these kind of cratery bits on the side here. So if I wanted to create a normal map on this, all I do is just press as normal, and of course we get this message. And I'm going to go ahead and disable messages right now because I think you get the idea that we have messages. So I'll press OK. And here is our finished bake here with these baked craters. So if I were to then press less to decrease these sizes, you can see how even though the geometry is down, we can still see the effect of the normal map there. So if I press my texture paint button, I can adjust this normal value of this new normal map that was created. Oh, and here's all the crazy sculpting I was doing on the front. That was a bit hard to see at first. Anyway, so if we could switch out of cycles, head back over to Blender Render, we can also see this normal map there in Blender Render as well. In addition to being able to simultaneously bake as many objects as we want to its own UV map, its own material, and its own image, we can also bake to a single map by selecting this Bake to Single option here. So let's go ahead and press File, New, Reload Startup File so we can get a fresh start here. Okay, so I'm going to open up my Models folder here and open up my Assets Library button, which lets me drag in stuff. And I'm going to drag in this armchair because it's made up of about 5 components, and so that's a good example for us to do multiple baking and stuff like that. And I'll close up my library there. So what I'm going to do is press 1 to go into front view, and I'm going to grab this big bulk of the chair, which everything else is parented to. So when I press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain to bring it on down, the whole thing moves. And then I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh add a plane, because I just want kind of like a basic ground for light and stuff to be able to bounce off of. And what I'm going to do is move this over here. And then a quick way to select all of the objects parented to something is to just come down here in the outliner and press Control and then click. And you'll notice when I did that here in the 3D view that everything got selected. And also if I press the plus sign in the outliner, you can see all the stuff belonging there. Just a quick way to, select everything. And then I'm going to press D to duplicate this over here because I think we're going to bake all the stuff on this one individually. Then we will bake all the components of this chair having checkmarked bake to single so we can see what that looks like. So as I've mentioned several times before, ZeroBrush is so badass that it can bake everything in your entire scene. And so it could bake stuff with materials or multiple materials, stuff that's UV mapped or not UV mapped, or things that have no UV maps, materials, images, or anything. So for instance, we could bake all of these objects here. I could shift select all of these, make sure they're all selected there. Maybe switch to material viewport shading so I can see the shadows from my light source, which actually happens to be hidden in the 3D viewport visibility. But as you can see, the render icon is still active, so it will show up when it renders, and also we can see its effects. But I just like to keep that off because I don't like to see it. But anyway, if we were to say add something to cast a shadow on here, like say a big giant Suzanne head, scale it up. And I don't know, I just want it to where the shadows are casting on, all all these different parts so we can kind of see what this looks like when we bake this. Come down here to select all of these parented things real quickly. As we can see, they're all selected. And with no materials, no UV maps, nothing in Blender Render or Cycles, doesn't matter which, we can press Q to bring up our ZB options. And under Bake Selected, I could bake a shadow map. However, if I were to bake these all out at 2048 by 2048, that would take a little longer than I want. So I'm going to drop these down to something convenient like 512 by 512. So if I press Q and Bake Selected, I could choose any of these options actually. Now baking them without knowing what the bake does won't necessarily turn out super great, but for instance, we could select shadow. We get the generic bake information message pop up here. I'm gonna go ahead and disable these for now and press OK. And that has now finished. The bake is complete there. So we can see the shadow still casting on here. But if we were to actually hide this and then say pick up this part of the chair, and actually I think I'll go ahead and turn off the darkness of the shadows so they're not affecting this at all, so we can just see what's been baked. So for instance, if I rotate this cushion around, you can see where that shadow area is on there. Or if I pick up this bottom cushion, you can see the outline of that Suzanne's head on that bit, and so on. Press Control Z to undo all that moving around, which I don't need. Of course, what's awesome about anything we bake in Blender Render, it's visible in Cycles, and anything we bake in Cycles is visible in Blender Render. So I could press my Texture Paint button. We did not have the option Bake to Single activated, so these were all baked to their own individual maps, UV maps, materials, and etc. If I wanted to, or adjust a layer value here, or add another color layer, and just start painting or whatever. And with the shadow layer selected, I could switch to Cycles. And this, of course, auto-converts everything that's been ZB painted, so we can see that shadow map we baked in Blender Render on all this stuff in Cycles. So I could turn around and, bake an ambient map right on all of these things here in Cycles, but I would want to first make sure they're all selected since I'm not using Bake to Single right now. So press the Object Mode button to get me back into Object Mode, and then Control Select all this stuff here, and then bring up my ZB options and do an ambient bake on top of everything else already going on with these materials. So let's do that. Well, actually, before we do that, let's increase the bake quality to say 150, so it's not like super grainy, and we'll see what that looks like within ambient bake. Notice now that we've disabled the messages, we don't get a message, so it's just going to sit here like this until it's done. Okay, so our ambient bake is finished of this chair, but you can see it looks pretty nice. We're not seeing the other layers because, of course, in Cycles mode, we can only display one of each of these layer types at a time. We can see up to one of each of these layers all at once in Cycles. So for instance, if I were to add a bump layer, and what was the last thing I clicked on? Oh, here. And then start, drawing a, well, this is a super low res 512 by 512 bump layer, which is why it looks all pixelated. But anyway, we can see up to one of these at a time. You'll notice that the word color inside of this color AO, which was that ambient occlusion layer we just baked, and color shadow, which we baked in Blender Render a minute ago. So we can actually only see one of these layer types at a time until we merge these layers. So if we were to press Cycles to switch back to Blender Render, we can actually see the effects of this ambient occlusion bake that we baked in Cycles, which looks very nice, as well as the shadow effect here. And then our, well, I guess I painted directly onto that color shadow layer there. Where's that color coming from? Oh, that's on a different object. Okay, I was wondering, because I kept, I was hiding the effects of these layers. I was like, why is that color on there? That's because we were painting directly onto this cushion here, because I'd added that. I'll go ahead and delete that layer. Okay, so if I click over to the Material tab over here, and I click on each one of these objects, you'll notice that the materials are individual for each one of these objects because we did not bake this with Bake to Single selected, but it actually doesn't matter. We can actually, at any time we want, merge all of these materials and UV maps to a single material, Or we could do it starting out with this option selected. But to merge these all we would do is, want to make sure they're selected. So we could just press B to do a border selection there, or we could use the method where we're control clicking on a parented object to select all of the children objects parented to it or whatever. And we could press bake to single here. And then we could perform a full material bake to bake all of this stuff together. Now, previously, this option was not checked, so each of these objects were baking to their own individual 512 by 512 maps. But since we have bake to single checkmarked, if we were to bake all of these objects to a 512 by 512 map, a single one, it would be super, super low res. So we're going to want to increase the size of this since it's now going to have to handle having all of those objects baked to it. So let's bump that up to 2048, which is still going to be pretty low res. Whoa, I don't want it that high. I'll be here all night. Just 2048 by 2048 there with baked single on. Let's see what happens when we do that, and we'll go ahead and do a full material bake here. All right, so that has finished up, and this is now, everything has been baked to a single material. So notice over here in the material tab of the properties panel, if we click on each one of these objects, notice that the material is now all the same for all of them. And the material that got distributed to everything just took on the name of the active object that we had selected when we performed the bake. But notice how all of these objects that were selected, and this could actually be as many as we wanted. We just had about 5 selected here, but they're all using the same material now. The same material is distributed. So if I were to click on the texture paint button here, and I were to say adjust the layer opacity of this layer, notice it affects all of the objects because they're all using that material. So we could switch over to cycles and see all that stuff there. We could add a new bump layer. And so notice that if I paint onto this bump layer here, and I were to click back into object mode and click on to some other object here and click the texture paint button, there's that same bump layer. And these are now all actually connected to each other, all on the same material, same UV map, and so on. I don't really recommend doing this, unless you have a reason to. Say, I don't know, you're creating a game asset that uses multiple objects, but they all have to be connected to the same UV map and material or something. So this is useful for doing stuff like that. So we can bake individual objects to their own UV maps and images and materials, or to a single UV map image and material on objects with no materials or UV maps or anything. But we can also do that to objects that do have their own UV maps, materials, or whatever. So to demonstrate that, we're going to give some materials to this object here in Cycles. I'm going to open up my Alchemy material library here, click on my categories, and under wood, I'm going to select this wood planks dark here and press use, and click on these armrest things that I imagine would be wooden, and then I'm going to shift select the rest of this stuff, and under fabric, leather is already selected there, press use, then go ahead and close my library up. And so now if I were to press Shift Z to go into render preview mode, and I'm going to want to make sure here in Sensei Format that optimize render is activated because it makes things go way faster and better. So here's what's going on in render preview, and I think I'm going to press Q and turn on my quick lights, which create a black world environment, and also add these cycles lights that show up only when we're rendering. So give us some nice dynamic lighting here. All right, so if I wanted to bake all of these things to a single map, all I would have to do is make sure they're all selected, and just want to make sure those legs are selected there. And so if we wanted to bake all this stuff to a single map, we would just make sure bake to single is checkmarked, which it is. And then under bake selected, I come down here and perform a full bake. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, our cycles bake has finished here. And of course, since we had the bake to single selected, you notice here in the material tab of the properties panel, we click on each one of these objects. They are all using the same material because they are all using the same UV map, and they're all baked to the same image. The displacement values on this are probably pretty intense because I don't think a leather chair would be like that cracked looking. So, maybe come back and bake this samples up to about 300 or 400, maybe bake on a larger map, or better yet, don't bake all this stuff to a single map so it's, you get a lot more resolution. But if you need to, you can, which is awesome. Of course, whatever we bake in cycles, here in ZeroBrush, we can switch that back to Blender Render. So we have this as an asset. What in the world happened there? Geez, don't tell me I did not have these things selected when I pressed bake. That's a pain. Well, let's bake those real quick too, I suppose, since they got missed in this bake selection. You can see these were using the same material, and that's what that wood looks like baked, and that's what it looks like still as a raw cycles material there. So I'm going to go ahead and let's give that a 512 map since it's not very big. It won't need a very big map to bake to. Let's just go ahead and bake that since I missed it in selecting everything, and I don't feel like waiting for it to bake again. So I'm just going to press full bake. Okay, so that's finished up. Luckily, that took a lot less time than the big 2048 map. And so now if we click on our texture paint button and switch out of cycles back into Blender Render mode, we can see all our sweet cycles bake stuff immediately here in Blender Render mode. We could export this for, a game asset or whatever we needed to do. Bake more stuff in Blender Render, or, bake more layers in cycles, however you want to start, jazzing this thing up and making cool stuff. And I'll actually click on one of the objects that actually got selected for the bake to single there, so we can see how, adjusting the bump value, even though we're just currently on this right here, which I'm painting on, we're actually controlling values for all the things that got baked to that single material there, which is pretty sweet. Probably Control Z that paint I just put on there I don't really need. You'll notice things in the 3D viewport are a bit darker than they are in Cycles Land. So we could maybe add a few point lamps around this place to jazz this place up. And yeah, oh man, that looks really cool. That can you imagine having a point lamp like this attached to a hanging overhead swinging lamp, old 40s style, a private eye office, and then the light shining back and forth off of the slight little bump values on this cycles baked leather. It looks awesome. Anyway, there's lots of cool stuff you could do. This is fun. Yeah, I love playing with lighting. It's something really easy to do in Blender as opposed to a lot of things which are hard, and it's so much fun. I wish I'd thought to do it more because it looks really cool. We've got this sweet cycles baked stuff we baked all in one shot, and we baked this all to a single material. So if for some reason you need to do that, you can. Alright, so I know this video is definitely totally starting to drag ass, but I also know that the features in the new ZeroBrush Bake system are really awesome, and there's some of you out there that are going to be really excited to find something you've been desperately needing probably for your workflow. So I'm going to continue on with just a few more sweet things that this puppy can do before we call it a day. So to do that, let's go ahead and press File and New and reload startup file. All right. One big advantage that the new ZB Bake system has over the old one is that, of course, yes, you can instantly bake on your multi-res sculpting stuff immediately as a normal map with this button here while you're sculpting. But you can now also bake as many objects as you want at a time, the normal maps. And just like we can do with any other option that we can bake with here, we can bake those either to their own individual materials, UV maps, and images, or to a single one. So we could say duplicate this object, and I'll just have 3 objects here, and I'll go into sculpt mode, and press this reset button here, and make all of these a bit different. So yeah, using that sweet circle anchor brush there, although that's probably a bit extreme. Let me lower that strength there. Yeah, that looks pretty sweet. Maybe a little more strength. I love playing with this thing. Anyway, so we've made some changes to that one. Let's make some changes to this one. I'll reset that. And maybe this time we'll use that line. We get a nice little message there saying, hey, hold Alt to constrain line. Okay, here's some random stuff here. I just wanted to make the point that we can actually bake all of these, the normals to all of these simultaneously. So we could actually, if you had a whole scene, so you had a whole city and you wanted to bake the normals to, and instead of having to do it, one by one, because you wanted to make sure that it all baked to its own individual UV map and material and everything, you could set it up to bake, go off and get some actual work done somewhere else, or I don't know, go do something. And then, just wait for it to finish. And you can also bake these all to a single map if that is required for whatever game engine you're using or resources or whatever. So we'll put these three over here, and we'll press D to duplicate and bring these over here. So let's shift select all these. These have no UV maps, no materials, nothing on them. However, they could be UV mapped or have materials, and we could still do this. And so to bake the normals on there, we just press Q, and we're not going to bake to single. We'll bake them all to their individual stuff and press well, before we do that, let's drop this down so I don't have to wait so long. And press normals here. And I restarted the file, so of course these messages will pop up. If you want to permanently keep these messages off, then you would just open up a new file, press disable messages, and then go save file and save startup file, and then they won't show up anymore. But otherwise they will show up, which you may want to keep them on for first couple of months when you get this thing, because there's some really helpful stuff in there that might trip you up otherwise. So yeah, I just disabled that, so now it is baking. And dang, that was really fast. Those normal maps baked really fast at 512 by 512 maps. There was no jump cut there. That was instant. So I could click on here and press my less button, which is the same as lowering all three of these at the same time, but I don't want to do that. I want to press less. And then so if we come here and we press Z, go into wireframe, press less even more, we can see this is what the size of the actual face is. And here is the baked in normal map detail. So if I click on the texture paint button and adjust this, we can see that. Of course, it's immediately visible in cycles. We could click on this color layer or add more, change the color over here, what have you, and adjust this normal value here or whatever. Switch back to Blender Render, click on the object mode to get out of that. And I can just drop the preview values of the subsurface of the multi-res here, just to show that this all worked here, that these were all normal maps of these individual objects were all baked. So we can drop less this, see here, and we can see that all of these have baked. We've got access to them in cycles, what have you, and sweet. Okay, so we're going to do a similar thing here. Wait, those aren't, I didn't have those selected too. Okay, no. So when we press less here, you can see it's just still the geometry. Fair enough. Okay, say these weren't three stupid blobs. Say these were this was like the handle of a gun, and this was like the barrel, and this was like the ignition chamber. I'm really ignorant about guns. I don't know what the parts are called, but imagine this stuff was all close and it was something, and you needed it to be a single map but still be separate objects. So to do that, all we would do is press Q to bring up our ZB options, press bake to single, then shift select everything we wanted to get baked to the same thing. And these guys are all going to bake to this single map, so I don't want it to be a super tiny 5x12 map. Plus, as you can see, the new bake system handles normal map baking a lot better. So I'm going to press enter in a 2048 by 2048 deal here, and these will all bake together. So let's press normals. All right, those have finished, which is cool. So I'm going to go ahead and lower all of the mesh detail on these so we can see the sweet effects of the normal map and not just the mesh still. So if we come down here and press Z to go into wireframe, we can see this is our low poly mesh now. And Z to go back, we can see the effects of what was the high poly mesh. But whereas when we would click on one of these objects and go into texture paint mode and adjust its normal value, it would only affect one of those. Now, because these guys are all using the same material, which was distributed at the time of the bake, because we used bake to single, and if we click in texture paint mode and adjust this normal value, notice it's adjusting for all three of these objects. And we could, color, add more layers, use textures, get crazy with it, whatever we wanted to do. Okay, so that's pretty sweet for sure. I'm going to go ahead and press File, New, Reload Startup File. Let's just see how a few of these other oddball kind of bake things can work. So let's see. Let's see how a displacement map works. The purpose of baking a displacement map is basically for use with a displace modifier. So that's one of the types that won't feed back into the layer system because it wouldn't really make sense to do so. For example of this, we could, go into sculpt mode, press make sculptable a bunch, and maybe come back into object mode, scale this thing up, and just sculpt some random junk on here. Use that sweet circle anchor thing, brush type thing, make some craters or whatever. And so say we had something like this and switch back into object mode. We can, under bake selected, we can choose displacement. And I'm going to go ahead and drop this map size down to about half, so 1024, so it doesn't take too long. And let's go ahead and bake a displacement map. Now notice when I do this, I get a special message letting me know the lowdown about what's going on with bake and displacement. The bake displacement map will not be integrated into the default ZB layer system, as I mentioned a second ago. Use this map after it's baked, add a displace modifier to a similar shaped object as the one baked. Then set the displace modifier's texture to the baked image, and the object must have a lot of faces for the baked map to work, it explains, or else you should add a subsurface modifier to the object before adding the displace modifier. And this is all stuff, instructions for after you bake to actually get it to work if you want to do that. So let's press OK. And that's done here. So notice this time nothing really gets put onto the object. If we go over to the material tab, we've got a basic material here. If we go over to the texture tab, here is that displacement map that baked for us. Now ZeroBrush will adjust settings both in the bake engine and in the scene to actually get this displacement map to do what it's supposed to, as well as influence settings and things like that, junk that you would have to look up online to figure out how to do, and it's annoying. So to get this displacement map to work, we've got to be using an object with a near identical UV map, or else have done this to a much more simpler object like a plane or something. So what I'm going to do is just press D to duplicate this object. But what I'm going to do is, if you'll notice, if I drop the multi-res information down here, it goes back to its default simple shape there. What I'm going to do is press X to delete that multi-res modifier to where we just got this cube again. And then I'm going to tap W a bunch of times, which in Sensei Format, tapping W in object mode adds smoothing and a subsurface modifier, and then tapping it more increases the subsurf levels. And I'm going to increase this to what this one was, which was 7 levels. Then I'm going to add a displace modifier. And so if we select the displacement that we just used, well, it'll look nuts first because we've got to set its texture coordinates to UV. This is all actually explained in the little pop-up message that shows up when you're baking, so if you forget. And notice here we've got almost the exact same detail, but this time it's actually coming from this image in this displacement modifier. Then we can control the strength and invert the strength. And that's definitely something we cannot do with our object over there just with that multi-res detail. So basically, yeah, this is pretty ridiculous. You know what? I'm just now coming up with an idea for this workflow. But one way to probably get a lot more oomph out of your normal maps would be to bake a displacement map like this. Then you could, duplicate the object like I just did and add a displacement modifier and use the actual bake detail like this. And say increase this higher and higher and crazier if you wanted to get a really strong normal map out of it. I don't know, just an idea, but that is pretty cool. Also, considering the fact that you can animate this stuff. So if I were to press I to insert a keyframe and drag this down 2 seconds and make it go way inversed, press I again, inserts another keyframe, and then make it crazy again. Whoa. Press I again, press back. And if I play this, it's going to go super slow because So much subdivision. Maybe I should drop it down a little bit. And awesome. That's super cool. Lots of stuff with the displace modifier that I just never thought to do because it's too hard. It's too much work to actually get a displacement map before ZeroBrush. No, it's not. So yeah, get to exploring stuff. Okay, we're going to experiment with a few more bake things before we go here. So I'm going to press File, New, and Reload Startup File. A few more little tests here in Blender Render. Let's check out baking vertex colors. So I'm going to double right click over here and add a monkey, tap W a few times, give it some smoothing. You know what I'm actually going to do? I'm going to apply this subsurface modifier. And let's actually just bring this up to about 1. And that way I can apply that and get a little bit more detail when painting in vertex paint mode, and then press W to add another subsurface modifier to make it smooth on top of that. Switch this to vertex paint mode, press T to bring up my tools. And there is a bit of ZeroBrush support for things like vertex paint mode and weight paint mode here. You've got your sweet ZeroBrush menu. So, you know, I could like paint vertex paint on here. And of course, with vertex paint, you're not using any materials or UV maps or images or anything. You're just, you know, painting vertex paint stuff. And I got on there and I probably didn't want it to. That's a different shade of blue, but whatever. And a lot less pixel density or polygon density on top of that head there. But anyway, I think you get the basic idea here. So if we had some reason to want to bake this, we can. Maybe you could press Control to smooth some of this stuff up. Okay, so if we wanted to bake this, we head back into object mode, which can't see our vertex paint colors in object mode unless we have some setting activated that I don't have right now activated. But we can bake these colors to an image, which is awesome. And I'll go ahead and drop this down so I don't have to wait any longer than I have to. And let's click vertex colors. Notice we get a nice custom message about baking vertex colors, just to make sure we know what's up. This will bake the object's vertex colors to an image. If you haven't painted vertex colors onto an object, hey, your object's going to be black when it bakes. So just letting you know stuff when you're trying stuff out and trying to get the hang of things. And sweet, our vertex paint has now been baked onto an image. So of course, we can just click on our texture paint button. We could adjust the bump value of this, which I don't know why we would. We can immediately go into cycles. So we've now got these vertex painted colors here available in cycles, which is awesome. We could, paint onto this, or whatever, switch back to Blender Render on whatever you wanted to do. We could add more layers. There's a nice bump layer on here. Load some cool texture brushes. Okay, what's some other stuff we can bake? We could bake emit, which is basically lighting effects, alpha, which is like where things are transparent. Let's go ahead and let's make another Suzanne head here. And I'll show you a few more bake options in cycles. So let's switch over to cycles here by pressing use cycles in the ZeroBrush menu. Under the cycles bake options, we could bake a UV map. So if I were to go ahead and do that, and I'm just going to drop this quality down because baking a UV map doesn't really require it. And click UV. And there we go. And this has now baked the basic UV map onto this object. This helps you understand like what the actual polygon faces of the object looks like. As you can see, if we press tab, go into edit mode, we can see, these lines actually come over each one of these colors, which you may actually come up with some sweet ideas. Like one cool thing you could probably do with this is you could easily, use ZB to bake a UV map and then use this image you baked as like a mask in cycles, like in the node editor, like say have this be a mask to hide emission or some other shader or something like that. But this video has definitely gone on probably way too long, but there was just a lot of stuff to cover. So if you already own ZeroBrush, I hope you're really excited to have seen this and excited about what you can make. And especially if you're a ZeroBrush owner who works primarily with games and you need ways to be able to bake sweet awesome, cool stuff from materials and things into game engines and stuff like that. So that's going to about wrap us up. If you don't own ZeroBrush, you can get a copy of it at blendersensei.com. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.